I heard her before I saw her. Sharp, impatient, the kind of voice that made people step back without being asked. "Don't talk to the old lady. She gets confused," my daughter-in-law said to the hotel clerk. And for a moment, I wasn't sure she meant me until the young man behind the counter looked past her shoulder with a polite, uncomfortable smile and avoided my eyes altogether. And that was when I understood that I had just been erased in a lobby full of strangers. I smiled, because that's what I've done for most of my life. I smiled and stepped aside as if I had misheard something insignificant, as if the words hadn't landed exactly where they were meant to, and I folded my hands neatly over the leather strap of my purse, the same purse I had carried through airports, doctors' offices, and years of raising a son who used to reach for my hand instead of pretending not to know me. The resort was everything the brochure promised. White marble floors, tall glass windows that let in the Florida sun, palm trees swaying just beyond the entrance. But standing there, I felt smaller than I ever had in my own home, smaller than the luggage carts rolling past me, smaller than the silence that followed her words. Just 3 months earlier, Daniel had called me, his voice warm in that practiced way he had learned over the years, telling me how much it would mean to him if I joined them on this family vacation, how the kids would love having grandma there, how Ashley thought it would be nice. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table, looking at the calendar, thinking maybe this was the beginning of something better. Maybe this was how families found their way back to each other after drifting too far apart. I paid for the flights without hesitation, upgraded their room when Daniel mentioned the ocean view, and insisted they let me handle the booking because I wanted everything to be perfect, because I believed that if I gave enough, loved enough, showed up enough, I would still belong somewhere in the life I had helped build. But from the moment we landed, something fell off in ways that were easy to dismiss if you wanted to believe in the best version of people. My seat had been 3 rows behind theirs on the plane. Ashley said it was a booking error. The car that picked us up from the airport only had room for 4, so I took a separate ride. Daniel said it would be quicker that way, and when we arrived at the hotel, they walked ahead of me as if I would naturally follow, as if I didn't need to be included in conversations about room keys or dinner reservations or anything that required a voice. And now here we were, at the front desk, where names and identities are confirmed with a simple glance at a screen, and mine had just been reduced to the old lady. Not Margaret, not Mom, not even a guest, just a vague inconvenience to be managed quietly so it wouldn't disrupt whatever version of the family they preferred to present to the world. The clerk handed Ashley the room keys, explaining the amenities with careful politeness, and she nodded as if she were the one in charge of everything, which, I realized, in many ways she already was, and Daniel stood beside her, checking his phone, his silence louder than anything she had said, because silence, I've learned, is where the real decisions live. I took the extra key when it was finally offered to me, my fingers steady, my smile still in place, and I followed them toward the elevators, my footsteps measured, my back straight, because dignity doesn't make noise when it leaves a room, it simply withdraws. And as the doors closed, reflecting our 3 faces in that narrow strip of mirrored steel, I saw it clearly for the first time, not just how they spoke to me, but who they had quietly decided I was, and more importantly, who they believed I would remain. I did not say anything in the elevator, and neither did they, but silence has a way of revealing more than words ever could, and as the numbers lit up one by one above the door, I watched Daniel's reflection in the polished steel panel, waiting for him to look at me, to acknowledge what had just happened, to offer even the smallest sign that he understood, but his eyes stayed fixed on his phone, scrolling slowly, as if whatever was on that screen required more attention than the woman who had stood in that lobby and been dismissed like an inconvenience. And Ashley, standing beside him, adjusted her sunglasses on top of her head and exhaled softly, already bored with a moment that had not cost her anything. When the doors opened, they stepped out first, their pace unhurried, confident, as if everything about this place belonged to them, and I followed a few steps behind, my key card held carefully between my fingers, the hallway stretching long and quiet with thick carpet that softened every sound. And for a brief second, I thought perhaps we would all be staying together, that maybe this was just a misunderstanding. But then Ashley stopped in front of a door near the end of the corridor and turned slightly, just enough to block my path without making it obvious, and said, "Oh, your room is actually on the other side." They upgraded us to a suite, her tone light, almost casual, as if she were doing me a favor by informing me after the fact, and I nodded, because that is what I have learned to do when explanations arrive too late to matter. I walked back the way we had come, past identical doors and framed prints of ocean waves, until I reached my room, a standard double with a partial view of the parking lot, and I let myself in quietly, placing my purse on the small desk and setting my suitcase beside the bed, the air conditioning humming steadily, filling the space with a kind of artificial calm that felt almost rehearsed, and I stood there for a moment, looking around, taking in the neutral colors, the neatly folded towels, the untouched glassware, and I realized that everything about this room was designed for someone passing through, someone temporary, someone who did not need to feel at home because they were never meant to stay long enough to belong. I sat down on the edge of the bed and smoothed my hands over the fabric of my dress, the same dress I had chosen carefully that morning, something light and appropriate for a family vacation, something that made me feel put together, included, and I remembered the way my granddaughter had hugged me at the airport, quick and distracted, already excited about the pool and the ocean, and I wondered how much she had noticed, how much any of them had noticed, or whether I had already become part of the background long before. We arrived here. My phone buzzed softly in my purse, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it was Daniel, that perhaps he had stepped away, realized something was wrong, and decided to reach out. But when I looked, it was a confirmation email from the hotel, thanking me for my reservation and reminding me that the full balance had already been paid in advance, and I stared at the screen a little longer than necessary, rereading the total, the dates, the details I had arranged weeks ago, and it settled in quietly, not like a shock, but like a truth that had been waiting for me to catch up to it, that I was not just an afterthought on this trip, I was the reason it existed, and yet somehow, I had been placed at the far edge of it, carefully positioned so that I could provide everything without being part of anything. I set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, listening to the steady hum of the room, and for the first time since we arrived, I did not try to explain it away. I did not search for excuses or soften the edges of what I had seen, because clarity, I have learned, does not come from asking the right questions. It comes from finally accepting the answers that have been there all along. And as I closed my eyes for just a moment, I understood that this was not about a room or a seat on a plane or even a sentence spoken too loudly in a hotel lobby. This was about a role that had been quietly assigned to me, one that I had been playing without realizing it. And the only question left now was how much longer I was willing to stay in it. I stayed in that room longer than I needed to, not because I was tired, but because stepping back out into that hallway meant stepping back into a version of myself I was no longer sure I recognized. And it took me a few minutes to gather the quiet composure I had relied on for decades, the same composure that had carried me through raising a child on my own after my husband passed, through long nights of balancing bills at the kitchen table, through every moment when putting someone else first felt like the right thing to do. And when I finally stood up, I did so slowly, smoothing the front of my dress again, as if restoring order on the outside could somehow reflect what I was beginning to rebuild on the inside. I left my room and followed the signs toward the pool area, where I knew they would be, the distant sound of laughter and splashing water guiding me before I even reached the glass doors. And when I stepped outside, the sunlight felt almost too bright, bouncing off the water and the white lounge chairs arranged in neat rows, families scattered across the space in easy, relaxed clusters. And for a moment, I simply observed, taking in the scene the way I might have years ago, when everything still felt like it belonged to me in some quiet, unquestioned way. I spotted them near the far end, Ashley reclining under a large umbrella, her sunglasses shielding her eyes as she scrolled through her phone, the children playing a few feet away, their voices light and carefree, and Daniel standing near the edge of the pool, talking to another man, his posture open, engaged, the version of himself he presented to the world when he felt comfortable, when he did not have to think too much about who was watching. I approached at a steady pace, not rushing, not hesitating, and when I reached them, Ashley glanced up briefly, offering a quick smile that did not quite reach her eyes, before returning her attention to the screen in her hand, and Daniel gave me a small nod, the kind you might offer a neighbor you recognize but do not know well enough to stop and talk to. And I felt it then, not as a sharp pain, but as a quiet confirmation that whatever role I had once held in this family had shifted into something smaller, something easier to overlook. I took a seat on one of the empty lounge chairs, placing my towel neatly beside me, and I watched the children for a while, letting their laughter fill the space between us, because it was the only sound that still felt genuine, the only part of this moment that had not been carefully managed or subtly redirected. After a few minutes, Ashley spoke, not to me, but to Daniel, her voice just loud enough for me to hear, commenting on dinner reservations, suggesting a restaurant she had seen online, something exclusive, something that required advance booking, and Daniel nodded, already agreeing, already planning, and when he mentioned the time, the number of seats, the details that determine who belongs at a table and who does not, there was a brief pause, a small space where my name could have been included, and then it passed, quietly, almost politely, as if leaving me out was not an act, but an assumption. I did not interrupt, I did not ask, I simply listened, because sometimes what is not said carries more weight than what is, and as the conversation moved on without me, I began to notice the pattern more clearly, the way decisions were made around me rather than with me, the way my presence was acknowledged only when it was convenient, the way even the smallest interactions were shaped to keep me at the edge of things, included just enough to maintain appearances, but never enough to truly matter. I leaned back in the chair, letting the sun warm my skin, and for the first time since we arrived, I allowed myself to stop trying to fit into the space they had left for me, because it was becoming increasingly clear that it had never been designed for me to stay. And as I watched Daniel laugh at something the other man said, his face relaxed, unguarded, I realized that this was not a momentary lapse or a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a conversation. This was a structure, something built over time, reinforced through small choices and quiet agreements. And I had simply been the last one to recognize it. And once you see something for what it truly is, you cannot return to the version of it you used to believe in. That evening, I returned to my room before they did, not because I had been invited elsewhere, but because I understood without being told that whatever plans they had made did not include me. And there is a certain kind of clarity in that realization, the kind that removes any lingering uncertainty and replaces it with something quieter, something steadier. And as I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoed in a way that felt final, not dramatic, not loud, just definitive, like a decision being made without the need for discussion. I placed my sandals neatly by the door and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the parking lot below, rows of cars arranged in perfect order, each one belonging to someone who knew exactly where they were going that night. And I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me, because stillness, I have learned, is where the truth tends to surface most clearly. My phone rested on the nightstand, silent, unchanged, and I did not need to check it to know there would be no message from Daniel explaining the dinner plans. No quick note saying they had assumed I would want to join, because assumptions like that are never accidental. They are built, reinforced, repeated until they become the default way of seeing someone. And I had been seen this way for longer than I cared to admit. I sat down at the small desk and opened my purse, taking out the folder I always carried with me when I traveled, not out of habit alone, but out of necessity, because years ago I had learned that being prepared was not a sign of mistrust. It was a form of self-respect, and inside that folder were copies of confirmations, receipts, the itinerary I had carefully arranged. Every detail of this trip documented in a way that left no room for confusion about who had made it possible. And as I flipped through the pages, my fingers moving slowly, deliberately, I felt something shift, not a surge of anger, not even disappointment, but a quiet recognition of imbalance, of how much I had given without ever asking what I was receiving in return. I thought back to the first time Ashley came into our lives, how I had welcomed her with genuine warmth, how I had told myself that families grow and change, and that making space for someone new was part of that process. And I remembered the small things, the dinners I had hosted, the holidays I had planned, the way I had adjusted without complaint when traditions were altered to suit her preferences, always believing that kindness would eventually circle back, that respect would follow, naturally. And yet here I was, sitting alone in a room I had paid for, on a trip I had funded, reviewing documents that confirmed what my presence in that lobby had already revealed. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it, my posture straight, my breathing even, because this was not a moment for emotion. This was a moment for understanding, and understanding, when it comes clearly enough, has a way of changing everything that follows. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, the last traces of sunlight fading into a deep blue that signaled the end of the day, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear music drifting from another part of the resort, laughter rising and falling in waves, the kind of sound that belongs to people who feel included, who feel certain of their place, and I listened to it without resentment, without longing. Because what I was beginning to realize was not that I had been excluded from something I wanted, but that I had been included in something that did not value me. And there is a difference between those two things that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. I reached for my phone then, not to check for messages, but to open my contacts, scrolling slowly until I found a name I had not needed to call in quite some time. Someone who had once helped me organize things when life required a more careful approach. And I paused there, my thumb hovering just above the screen, not hesitating, not questioning, simply acknowledging that the next step, whatever it would not be made out of impulse, but out of clarity, and clarity, I have learned, is far more powerful than reaction. My thumb did not hesitate for long, and when I finally pressed the call button, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not tension, just a quiet alignment between what I had been seeing and what I was now choosing to do. And as the phone rang, I stood up and walked slowly back toward the window, watching the last light disappear beyond the horizon, because timing, I have learned, matters less than clarity, and I had both. When the voice on the other end answered, calm and professional, I spoke in the same measured tone I had used for years, introducing myself without urgency, without explanation, simply stating my name and asking if he had a few minutes to speak. And when he recognized it, there was a brief pause, followed by a warmth that felt grounded, familiar, not performative, the kind of response that comes from someone who understands the weight behind a call like this without needing it to be spelled out. I told him I was traveling, that I would not need anything immediate, but that I wanted to review a few arrangements when I returned, just to ensure everything was structured the way I intended, and I chose my words carefully, not because I was unsure, but because precision matters when you begin to shift the foundation of something others have taken for granted. And he listened without interruption, asking only a few direct questions, confirming details I already knew, and when the call ended, it did not feel like the beginning of something new. It felt like the continuation of something I should have addressed a long time ago. I set the phone down and returned to the desk, opening the folder again. But this time I did not flip through it slowly. I looked at it with purpose, at the reservations, the confirmations, the payments that had made this entire trip possible, and I realized how easily generosity can be mistaken for permanence, how quickly support becomes expectation when it is offered without condition, and how quietly people adjust their perception of you when you never challenge the role they have assigned. There was a knock at the door sometime later, light, almost hesitant, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I stood anyway and walked over, opening it just enough to see Daniel standing there, his expression neutral, not concerned, not apologetic, just checking in because it was expected of him at some point. And he said they had gone to dinner, that the restaurant had been busy, that they assumed I might have been resting, his explanation delivered in the same, even tone people use when they are describing something minor, something that does not require further discussion, and I listened without interrupting, nodding once. Because sometimes allowing someone to speak without resistance reveals more than any question could. He asked if I needed anything, and I told him no, that everything was fine, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker across his face, not guilt exactly, but a moment of uncertainty, as if he had expected something else, some reaction he could respond to, and when it did not come, he seemed unsure of what to do next, and after a few more words, he left. The hallway quiet again as the door closed between us. I returned to the desk and sat down, placing both hands flat against its surface, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palms, grounding myself in something tangible, something steady, and I let the silence settle once more, not heavy, not empty, just clear, because clarity does not need noise to exist. It simply requires that you stop ignoring what is already there. And as I sat there, I understood that nothing I had experienced that day was accidental. Not the words in the lobby, not the distance on the plane, not the separate room, not the dinner I was not invited to. It was all part of a pattern, a structure that had been built over time, reinforced through small, consistent choices, and now that I could see it fully, I also understood something else, something just as important, that patterns can be changed, structures can be adjusted, and roles, no matter how long you have played them, can be redefined the moment you decide they no longer fit. I woke up earlier than I needed to the next morning, not because I had plans, but because once your mind settles into clarity, it no longer waits for permission to move forward. And for the first time since arriving, I did not check my phone to see if anyone had reached out. I did not wait for footsteps in the hallway or voices outside my door. I simply got up, moved through the room at my own pace, and prepared for the day as if it belonged entirely to me, because in a way that mattered more than anything else, it finally did. I chose a simple outfit, something comfortable for the warm weather, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not search for signs of exhaustion or disappointment. I looked for steadiness, and I found it in the way my shoulders remained relaxed, in the way my expression held, not forced, not rehearsed, just calm, and I realized that nothing about what had happened yesterday needed to be corrected with confrontation, because not every shift requires noise, some only require withdrawal. I left the room and walked toward the main lobby, the early morning air, still cool before the heat of the day settled in, and the resort felt different at that hour, quieter, less curated, staff moving with purpose, guests only beginning to appear, and when I reached the front desk, the same young clerk from the day before was there, organizing paperwork behind the counter, and when he saw me, he hesitated for just a moment, as if unsure whether to approach me directly or wait to be addressed, and I stepped forward, offering him a polite smile, not out of obligation, but because I chose to. I asked a few simple questions about the resort, about the breakfast options, about the walking paths nearby, and he answered with careful professionalism, his tone respectful, his attention steady, and there was no confusion in the way he spoke to me this time. No redirection, no avoidance, just a straightforward interaction between two people. And it struck me then how easily respect appears when it is not interrupted by someone else's narrative. After that, I walked outside and followed one of the stone paths that led away from the main building, lined with palm trees and low hedges, the ocean visible in the distance, and I moved at a measured pace, not rushing, not trying to reach a destination, simply allowing myself to exist in a space where no one was assigning me a role, and with each step, I felt something loosen, not something heavy, but something subtle, the expectation to adjust, to accommodate, to remain in place even when that place no longer fit. I found a bench overlooking the water and sat down, resting my hands lightly in my lap, watching the waves move in a steady rhythm that did not change for anyone, and I thought about the years behind me, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement of how often I had chosen patience over boundaries, how often I had mistaken endurance for strength, and how easily those choices had been accepted, even relied upon, by the people around me. My phone buzzed then, and this time when I looked, it was a message from Ashley, short and practical, asking if I would be available later in the afternoon to watch the children while they went out for a few hours, and I read it once, then again, not searching for tone, not analyzing intent, simply recognizing it for what it was, a continuation of the same pattern, the same assumption that my time, my presence, my willingness would always be available without question, and for a moment, I considered how I might have responded before, how quickly I would have said yes, how naturally I would have adjusted my plans to fit theirs, but that version of me felt distant now, not gone, just no longer in control. I placed the phone back beside me on the bench and looked out at the water again, letting the silence stretch, not uncomfortable, not empty, just deliberate. And I did not respond right away, not because I needed time to think, but because I had already made the decision that mattered most, and everything else would follow from that. Because once you stop playing a role, the script no longer applies. And what comes next is not something you react to, it is something you choose. I did not answer her message right away, and that in itself felt like a quiet shift, something small on the surface, but deeply unfamiliar underneath. Because for years I had responded immediately, almost instinctively, as if my availability was a given rather than a choice. And as I sat there watching the ocean move in its steady rhythm, I realized that I was not delaying out of uncertainty. I was simply no longer rushing to meet an expectation that had never been questioned before. After a while, I picked up my phone and typed a short reply, careful and calm, not cold, not emotional, just clear, telling her that I had already made plans for the afternoon and would not be able to watch the children, and I read it once before sending it, not to soften it, but to ensure it said exactly what I meant, nothing more, nothing less, and when I pressed send, I felt something settle into place, not satisfaction, not relief, just alignment. The response came faster than I expected, a brief message from Ashley, asking what plans I had. The wording polite but edged with something else, something that suggested surprise, maybe even mild inconvenience, and I looked at the screen without reacting. Because the question itself was not really about my plans, it was about whether I still fit into the role she had assigned me, and for the first time, the answer was no. I did not explain, I did not justify. I simply replied that I would be unavailable and left it at that. And then I placed the phone face down beside me, letting the conversation end on its own, because not every boundary requires a discussion. Some simply require consistency. I stayed by the water a little longer, watching as more guests began to fill the space, families gathering, children running ahead, parents calling after them. And there was something steadying about observing it without needing to place myself inside it, without measuring what I had against what I was seeing. And after a while, I stood up and made my way back toward the main building, my steps unhurried, my thoughts clear. When I entered the lobby, I noticed Daniel sitting in one of the chairs near the entrance, his posture slightly tense, his attention shifting the moment he saw me. And I could tell he had been waiting, not long, but long enough to feel the absence of something he had taken for granted. And as I approached, he stood up, offering a small smile that did not quite settle, and asked where I had been, his tone casual. But there was something underneath it now, something searching, and I told him I had gone for a walk, that it was a nice morning, and he nodded, as if that answer was both expected and unfamiliar at the same time. He mentioned Ashley's message, said she had been trying to coordinate the afternoon, and there was a pause after that, a space where he seemed to be waiting for me to step back into the role they both understood, to offer to help, to adjust, to fill in whatever gap had been left by my refusal, but I did not move to fill it. I simply listened, my expression steady, my posture relaxed, and after a moment, he cleared his throat slightly and said they would figure something else out, that it was no problem, and I nodded once, because I believed him, not because the situation was resolved, but because for the first time, it was not mine to resolve. We stood there for a few seconds longer, the conversation reaching its natural end without needing to be extended, and then he gave a small, uncertain nod before stepping away, and I watched him go, not with disappointment, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet recognition that something had shifted, not just for me, but for him as well, because when patterns change, even slightly, everyone who relied on them feels the difference, whether they understand it immediately or not. I turned then and walked toward the elevator, my reflection catching briefly in the polished surface of the wall, and for the first time since arriving, I did not look like someone waiting to be included. I looked like someone who had already decided where she stood, and more importantly, where she no longer would. That afternoon, the resort seemed busier than before, the pathways filled with guests moving between the pool, the restaurants, and the beachfront, and I moved among them without urgency, without looking for anyone, because for the first time since arriving, I was not trying to align my steps with theirs. I was simply following my own. I had spent most of the day away from the main areas, walking along the shoreline, stopping when I felt like it, sitting when I wanted to rest, and there was a quiet clarity in that kind of movement, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's schedule or approval. And by the time I returned toward the center of the resort, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the lobby and turning the glass walls into mirrors that reflected more than they revealed. I noticed them before they saw me, gathered near the entrance to one of the restaurants, Ashley speaking animatedly to the host, her posture confident, her gestures precise, Daniel standing just behind her, the children shifting impatiently beside them. And for a moment, I paused, not to avoid them, but to observe, because distance, even a few steps, can change what you notice. Ashley's tone carried across the space, polite but firm, The kind of voice that assumes cooperation without asking for it. And the host nodded quickly, adjusting something on the screen, and I recognized the dynamic immediately. The same quiet control, the same expectation that things would be arranged to suit her without question. I walked toward them then, not to join, not to interrupt, just to pass through the same space. And as I drew closer, Daniel looked up, his expression shifting slightly when he saw me. A flicker of something uncertain crossing his face before settling into a familiar neutrality. And Ashley glanced in my direction, her smile brief, measured, as if acknowledging me required only a moment of attention before returning to what mattered more. "We managed to get a table," she said to Daniel, not to me, her voice light, satisfied, and he nodded, glancing at the children, then back at her, already moving forward, already stepping into the space that had been prepared for them. And there was a moment, a small one, where they could have turned, could have included me, could have asked, but the moment passed as naturally as breathing, because habits like that do not feel like choices when they have been practiced long enough. I did not stop them. I did not speak. I simply continued walking, my pace unchanged, my direction steady, and as I moved past the restaurant entrance, I caught a glimpse of the dining room inside. Tables set neatly, guests seated in small groups, conversations unfolding in soft, overlapping tones, and I understood that I was not being left out of something I needed. I was being spared something that no longer fit me. I continued through the lobby and out toward a quieter section of the resort, where a smaller lounge overlooked the water, and I chose a seat near the edge, where I could see the horizon clearly, the line where the ocean met the sky stretching out without interruption, and I sat there as the light shifted, the colors deepening, the air cooling slightly as evening settled in, and I let the silence return, not as something empty, but as something intentional. My phone remained in my bag, untouched, not because I was avoiding it, but because I no longer needed it to define where I belonged in that moment. And as I watched the last light fade, I realized that nothing about this day had required me to argue, to explain, or to demand recognition. Everything that needed to change had already begun to shift simply because I had stopped participating in what no longer aligned with me. And there is a kind of power in that, a quiet, steady power that does not announce itself, does not seek validation, but simply exists the moment you decide that your place is not something others get to define for you. The next morning arrived with the same quiet certainty that had settled over me the day before, and I moved through it without hesitation, packing my suitcase carefully, folding each item with the same deliberate attention I had always given to things that mattered, because leaving a place, I have learned, is not just about physical movement. It is about closing something properly, without urgency, without unfinished edges. And when I zipped the bag shut, it felt less like the end of a trip and more like the completion of something I had finally understood. I checked out at the front desk just after sunrise, the lobby still calm, the staff moving with quiet efficiency, and when the clerk asked if everything had been satisfactory, I offered a polite smile and told him it had been exactly what I needed, which was true, just not in the way the question was intended, and he nodded, handing me the final receipt, the total already settled days before. And there was a brief moment where I considered how easily everything had been processed, how smoothly arrangements had been made, how little any of it had required acknowledgement beyond a transaction, and I accepted that as part of the clarity I was taking with me. Outside, the air was cool, the sky just beginning to lighten, and I stood for a moment beside my suitcase, looking back at the building, not with attachment, not with regret, just with recognition, because places, like people, reveal themselves fully when you stop trying to see them differently. My car arrived shortly after, the driver stepping out to assist with my luggage, his manner straightforward, respectful, and I thanked him before settling into the back seat, the door closing softly behind me. And as we pulled away, the resort receded in the rearview mirror, growing smaller with each passing second, until it became just another shape against the horizon. My phone buzzed somewhere in my bag, and I did not need to check it immediately to know who it might be, the timing too precise, the pattern too familiar, and when I finally reached for it, I saw multiple messages, Daniel's name appearing more than once, Ashley's as well, short notes layered with a tone that had shifted, no longer assuming, now asking, now trying to reconnect the space that had quietly changed, and I read them without urgency. without reaction, because what they were responding to was not something that could be undone with a conversation. It was something that had already moved beyond that point. I placed the phone back into my bag and looked out the window, watching the landscape change as we drove, palm trees giving way to open roads, the ocean disappearing from view, replaced by something more familiar, more grounded, and I thought about the call I had made, the arrangements I had set in motion, not as a form of retaliation, but as a correction, a realignment of something that had been allowed to drift too far in one direction. And I understood that what would follow would not need to be explained in detail. It would be understood through action, through the absence of what had once been constant, through the quiet restructuring of roles that no longer served me. By the time we reached the airport, the sun had fully risen, casting a steady light across everything, and I stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath before retrieving my suitcase. The movement simple, familiar, and as I walked toward the entrance, I felt no need to look back, because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore, and everything ahead of me, every decision, every boundary, every choice, belonged entirely to me, and that, more than anything else, was the only confirmation I needed that something fundamental had changed, not around me, but within me, and that change, once made, does not reverse itself for anyone. In this deeply emotional and thought-provoking narrative, an elderly mother finds herself quietly erased during a luxury vacation she funded for her own family, only to realize that the role she has been playing for years was never truly valued. Through subtle moments of exclusion, controlled interactions, and a defining public humiliation, the mother-in-law begins to see the truth behind her daughter-in-law's calculated behavior and her son's silence, revealing a powerful exploration of dignity, boundaries, and self-worth that resonates strongly with audiences who seek meaningful family stories. As the story unfolds, the mother-in-law transitions from quiet endurance to quiet control, choosing not to confront but to observe, withdraw, and ultimately redefine her place, while the daughter-in-law's dominance and manipulation gradually lose their power in the absence of compliance, making this one of those rare family stories where transformation happens not through confrontation but through clarity. Set against the backdrop of a beautiful resort, the contrast between external luxury and internal emotional distance highlights the painful reality many face in modern family stories, where respect is often replaced by convenience and presence becomes conditional. The narrative carefully builds tension through realistic interactions, grounded dialogue, and internal reflection, allowing viewers to connect with the mother-in-law's journey as she reclaims her autonomy and silently restructures the dynamics that once defined her role, making this a compelling addition to the genre of family stories that focus on emotional awakening rather than dramatic revenge. By the end, the quiet power shift leaves a lasting impact, showing that sometimes the strongest response is not loud or visible, but deeply intentional. A message that elevates this story among the most memorable family stories for audiences who value depth, realism, and emotional intelligence. Character 1 is a white, elderly woman age around 70, with silver hair neatly styled, wearing a modest, elegant light blue dress, standing in a hotel setting, front-facing camera, realistic lighting, natural skin texture, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2 is a white woman in her mid-30s, with long blonde hair styled perfectly, wearing a stylish, modern outfit, confident posture, sharp facial features, subtle, cold expression, standing in hotel lobby, front-facing camera, realistic lighting, natural skin texture, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.